I would now like to invite Swati and Akar up on stage to begin the discussion.
The light is a little harsh, but I guess it's okay. um, this film, even when I watched it first and I watched it now, it sort of seems to strike several very different notes, quite at variance with each other, and leaves you with such a range of conflicting emotions that it sort of, you don't really know how to respond immediately. You're responding to the, the film, as it were, and how it's made, but you're also responding to what's happening to the man himself. It's hardly a conventional biopic. It's just, in fact, recording. Hello, can you? Yeah. It's hardly a conventional biopic of a person. It's just, in fact, recording a very brief period in his life while he is in Germany, and then his decision to return to Russia and to actually follow him to Russia until he's arrested. And, parts of the film play like a thriller, as you see this rather good-looking man who survived an attempt on his life and is trying to find out who has killed him. It's also but while you're watching with bated breath to see what's going to transpire in those phone conversations, there's this very sobering and chilling thought that this is not an actor and it's not a script that you can manipulate the end of. It is a real person whose life is at stake. It's also a sort of an intimate family portrait, because you see the wife and the children and the sort of goodbyes to the children as they depart. And of course, the end of the film is very, very somber because of his arrest, but also because today we know more than that, and we know that he's no more. He died last year in February, and most likely was murdered. In fact, before we talk about the film and about the protagonist, my first, not even a question, but really a point of reflection is about the act of documenting itself. What does it mean to document? Why do we make documentary films? What did it mean for Daniel to fly to this place and spend this time and film with him and right up to his arrest? Documenting, this kind of filmmaking is done with great conviction and with a sense of purpose. You don't always know what the film also is going to be like, and leave alone what its future might be. And as it turns out, in this case, Navalny the film and Navalny the man had two very different trajectories. The film went on to win the Oscar, and the man was languishing in prison. Today, knowing what we do, and yet I think it was important to have documented this story and placed it on record. What, Akar, would you say today, from what we know, is the purpose of a film like this? What would you say? What sort of purpose does it serve, this story being told on film the way it has been?
The way that I saw the film was that and I think this is true especially of men, I don't know if it's true of all of us, we aspire to a purity in heroism, that we want somebody who is white in a world that we see is black. And I think somebody as brave as this person clearly was, knowing what the background of the Russian state is, knowing the dangers that he put himself through when he entered the polity, knowing the, the poisoning that he went through himself and survived, for him to go back to that place, I think is something that is inspirational in a way that very few things are. So that is the purpose of this story. It tells us that an individual's resistance means something in very dark times, in times when a state as powerful as the one in Russia, a very old state, this is a state that knows itself in a way that the state in Iran or the way in China does. This is not a new state. This is a state with bureaucrats who know the way government functions. To be able to take that kind of force on with the risks that you see, not just to yourself, but also to your children and your wife, I think that is the purpose of the story. That is the brave bits. The bit that is untold, I think, is also as important as the one that was told to us in this story. And I presume that one reason that I was asked to come here was to speak about those bits, that Navalny was somebody who referred to Muslim immigrants as cockroaches, which is not something you saw on the screen. That his nationalism was a white nationalism. That when he spoke of Russia and Russian resistance against Putin, it was a ethnic and ethno-nationalist sort of resistance to the state that Putin put up. And the organization that I represent, it named him as a prisoner of conscience, as somebody who was jailed purely because of belief, not because of any crime committed, but because of the fact that we believed as an institution that he was in jail because of the fact that the Russian state and Putin disagreed with his views, which I believe to be true, no matter what else he might have been in his personal life. There was resistance within Amnesty to name him that. A bit of historical background might be of use here. Nelson Mandela was not named a prisoner of conscience by us. And the reason for that was that in 1965, the basis of naming somebody a prisoner of conscience is that we feel, as a movement, that a person who has been jailed for her or his beliefs should not have, in the entirety of their lives, called for violent resistance or violence of any form. The ANC, the African National Congress, under Mandela, had asked for violent resistance against apartheid, which I think, as a member of Amnesty, was absolutely legitimate. I don't, for a moment, want to condemn Hamas for acts of apartheid, for acts of genocide, and their resistance to them being besmirched by a gaze that is essentially Western. And I think something similar was true in 1965 of the Amnesty decision to not name Mandela a prisoner of conscience, but those are the rules by which we live. That violence of any form ought not to be tolerated, whether in text or in real life. Navalny was a complex figure. That he did not see the world, he did not see his politics in the way that a Mandela would have, or a way that a Zoran Mamdani would have. He saw it from the point of view of an electoral dynamic of the sense that Kasparov sees it. And I think that that is something that we ought to understand. The other bit, and I'll close here, is we need to understand why it is that the Russian state under Putin has remained in some ways, and some would say in many ways, popular in the last 25 years, and maybe we can talk about that, given the fact that it's clear that if a man shows such courage in the open as he has, and is seen by his own people, not just all of us around the world, as resisting Putin, who clearly is authoritarian, why is it that there is some element of support for the Russian state, for Putin, in these last 25 years, given the facts the way that we have seen them?
When you say support, you mean that because the elections are not seen to be fair, so how much of it is support and how much of it is wasn't that also the point that that the regime is authoritarian enough that, because you do see protesters in rather large numbers that support Navalny.
We do. So this is a state of 100 billion. So this is a fairly large nation. In democratic societies like ours, I think we want to see the whiteness of rule of law, parliamentarianism, justice, as separated from the tyranny, the black of dictatorship, authoritarianism. The problem is that the world exists mostly in the gray.
Yes.
And for many Russians who are, I'm 55, but let's say there's somebody either 10 years younger or 10 years older than I am, the memory of the state after the glory of the end of the century, after Tolstoy, after Turgenev, after Dostoevsky, and the rise of a force that took on what we refer to today as the West, came about mostly because of the fact that the West lied to Russia. That as the Cold War was winding down, the state that the US was leading with Jim Baker as the foreign secretary promised to the Russians, and these are the words that they use, not 1 inch, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward after the end of the Cold War. But what happened in the 25 years that Putin has been charged, he's been in charge since 1999, is that every United States president that's taken power has moved NATO towards the Russian border. So Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland in 99, under Clinton, under Bush Jr., NATO expanded vastly. 7 or 8 nations came in. It expanded again under Obama and under Biden and under Trump. Every successive US presidency has brought NATO and its tanks and its fighters and its missiles closer to the Russian border. Many Russians would see what we have witnessed in the last 3 years with the war in Ukraine as something that was provoked and imposed on them. And that Putin is doing essentially what any Russian nationalist would do. And I think that there are 2 frames of looking at this. I don't know if we can necessarily conclude that one of them is right. But this is the basis of Putin's power, that Putin exists with very little internal resistance for the fact that the West has chosen to expand its military and bring it closer to the old USSR's borders and threaten Russia in a way that they feel that the only way to be able to survive is to be able to have a strong man in charge and to eliminate whatever resistance that person might have, especially resistance that comes out of that emanates out of people who are seen as being backed by the West. So when you have documentaries in English coming out of Europe and the US, with no reference to any background to what this person is saying or doing, except for his martyrdom, which I think is true, which I believe is real. That is the granularity that we will miss when we try and examine the whole story.
So this film certainly has been made by a Western filmmaker, and it does have the Western perspective. What I felt was that since it features him so extensively, and the investigative journalists who are trying to find out how he was poisoned and by whom. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so just to repeat, this is a film that has been made by a Canadian filmmaker. It does have a Western perspective. It makes Alexei Navalny a hero. It does portray him as a hero. But I would say that since this is a film that features him extensively while he is in Germany, and this team of journalists, which is Maria and Grozhev, who are trying to find out, who killed him and why. And since you hear him, including the uncomfortable question that the filmmaker asks him about having, aligned himself with what he calls the Nazis within Russia, to which, of course, he says that it's a compromise. Political leaders often are compromised figures, and as you said, this sort of purity of purpose is that a luxury perhaps that they may not be able to afford? It depends. But I feel that while this film is made with that Western perspective, since it features him so extensively and having him talk, it gives, if not the Russian, but at least his perspective very clearly, which is not necessarily, yes, he's backed by the West, but he is also saying what he believes in and is talking about his work. So in that sense, it's not a film that is made about Russia by the West, and of which that narrative is very well known. And, without sort of falling into that trap of that narrative, how do we still understand the extreme authoritarianism that we do see, especially towards, the harshness with which he's treated once he lands, and he is, from what we all know, we've read, he's sent from one penal colony to the other till it's solitary confinement, and it's torturous conditions till he actually dies.
This is as good a film as you can make on somebody who is a real hero. I don't think that should be doubted. None of us is perfect, none of us is pure. The fact that the director chose to retain or not retain bits of this person's life, to my mind, are largely either not relevant or not important, in the sense that the trajectory of the story begins from resistance and ends with death, which is the true story of a martyr. Somebody who chooses to go to his end knowing what he's about to witness. And I think that this film that we saw reflects that. The brutality of the Russian state, I think this audience and you and I are much more able to understand than other democracies, because we live in a society which is similar. How many Indians go to jail never to come out? How many of them have stories which are never told? We could write 100,000 Navalnys each decade. That gray space that exists between rule of law and justice and what actually transpires in societies that claim to be democratic but are not really, which are not really, not only because of the fact that they are controlled by some evil person as Putin is. I have no doubt that Putin is as hard and cold a man as any ruler has been in history. Not just because of that fact, but because of the fact that the entire polity, from the woman and the man masked who are letting him in through immigration and going in to pick him up, and having very little compunction, and if not compunction, very little morality, knowing what it is that they are going to put him through, this has become normal. And I think that this story tells those parts of the world, including ours, that it's not just about the fact that you've got one villain on top of a structure that decides and conceives and executes something of this nature, but a whole system of people, a whole structure of entities, including courts, including the police, including lawyers and the justice system, that lets this happen under the guise of written law, written constitutions, much more often than I think the world realizes. And I would see this movie through our own lens and through our own martyrs.
Yeah, because authoritarianism takes many different forms, and it's, as you said, even in a democracy like ours, we have had prisoners of conscience. I would like to throw this discussion open to our viewers and invite questions, if any, or comments about the film or about the subject of the film, or the larger questions that it raises in everyone's minds. Yes, there's somebody there.
Yeah, I would like to ask that with like you directly compared with what is happening in India. So with rise of authoritarian leaders all around the main, largely populated pockets of the world, where do you think is the world headed? I mean, is there going to be any point of inflection where people are going to, rise, or what do you think is going to unfold? Because if ruthlessly any opposition is going to be put into prison, complete authoritarian, I mean, they have shown how they are tracking every data of a person who is traveling anywhere and tracking the person. So how do you think that with this increased surveillance with AI, we saw what's happening in Palestine? So how do you look at things are ever going to change if they're going to control social media, they're going to control all our data, everything? Where are we headed?
I think you're right. I think it's going to become harder for us over the next 5-10 years because the state has much more information that it can use, and courts are not particularly questioning enough in our part of the world especially, but in most parts of the world, to be able to push back against the state. So when the state puts up evidence as weak as it has in the case of, say, somebody like Umar Khalid or Stan Swamy, the courts are willing to be able to accept that as being fact till such time as it is disproven. But what you said, given the amount of data that the state can throw at the court, this person was here at this time, meeting with this person on this WhatsApp group, it will become more and more difficult for civil society and the people like Navalny to be able to resist the state. Where it leads to, I don't know, but I think the immediate 5 and 7 years will be harder than the 15 or 20 years before.
Hi, I have two questions. The narrative of Moscow 4, presumably stupid intelligence bureau of Russia, but that's not the that's not the narrative we have heard all our lives, and we have seen journalists across the world like snooping into what goes on in Russia. So if that were true, we would have known more about. So is that an exaggeration? Because that does not paint an entire picture. And secondly, how much do you think does the fact that it has to do with Russia has played a role in Navalny winning an Oscar award? Like because how forgiving the West in general has been towards Israel. What is its what is its fascination with Russia still, even after the Cold War?
About the award, I'll just say one thing, and then of course all awards, there is politics to awards. You know, awards are not sort of in some rarefied space away from the politics of what's going on around. So yes, of course, it's difficult to say that, are we saying that this film won an award only because it was about Russia and that didn't deserve, and perhaps other films, we had a strong contender from India for the Oscars that year, All That Breathes. But it's difficult to say that, but one must realize that, awards are part of the larger sort of the geopolitics of our times. They are not separate from it. So we have to sort of keep that in mind always. That's just about the question about the awards, but he also asked about...
On the other question, I think that the state will be as incompetent or competent as it is in the other aspects of what it does. And I would look at India, to give you an example with what the KGB or the FSB might or might not be doing. We should assume that the Enforcement Directorate and the Central Bureau of Investigation is as competent as the Post Office, as the local school, and as the Government of India when it seeks to build footpaths and roads. To assume that there is a bunch of people who are extremely bright under somebody like Doval, who are looking at something and are able to understand the world in the way that you and I cannot, would I think not be right. Having personally encountered the CBI and the ED, I can tell you that the answer to your question is that it is entirely possible that it is stuffed with people who are not properly aware of what they are saying or who they are speaking to on the phone, and might reveal things that they ought not to be. And I was not surprised to be told at the end of the movie that that person has not been heard of since. Because the idea that just like the justice system and the Supreme Court, that if we elevate somebody and we think of them as being superior in some way, Chief Justice Chandrachud or whoever we might seek to name, being very special and different from you and I would say is wrong. And I think that they are as bright or as dumb as I am, and they will make the same mistakes that I will.
There's a question there, yeah.
Well, it's not really a question. I just wanted to go back to something that was discussed in the previous question, where the whole thing was about how what is going to happen in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time because of the use of, the availability of data by a government. But then when I reflect back on the film that we just watched, on the documentary that we just watched, it's also interesting to note that how Navalny makes use of data and information that's available in order to sort of like put himself out there and, make his standpoint much clearer to an audience. It also shares the ease with which he works with social media, for instance, as well. I found that also interesting. So it's not just about, say, a government or an authoritarian body having access to data, but it's also other individuals.
Everybody having access to data. In fact, the investigative journalists make use of it in tracking how...
And that's completely true, that we have much more access. The problem is that laws are written with the reversal of burden of proof. That the laws in India where a presumption of innocence is upturned It began with narcotics, with TADA in the 80s, POTA, UAPA, where the court will assume that anything that the government puts up is fact, and you don't have the chance to respond, even if you do have the material, whether through social media or whatever else. And that makes it slightly more difficult, which is why I said 5-7 years. I'm sure the jurisprudence will actually evolve in time and make it slightly easier, particularly in democratic societies. But I foresee that what we are going through right now will continue at least for the next 5 years.
John Lennon once said that a direct and strident opposition, especially if it turns violent, is something that the state knows very well how to deal with. And what they don't know how to deal with is humor. And so I was thinking of what's happening in Portland, where the protests against ICE agents, they're now wearing these comedic costumes of inflated frogs and chickens. And clearly the ICE people don't know how to deal with that. So is that something that opposition against an authoritarian state should turn to, looking more at humor, music, poetry, rather, and not just at this strident politics?
There is no question that the most effective antidote to tyranny is humor. How much space do you have available to you to, if you live in a country where in the Prime Minister's constituency, Varanasi, if a stand-up comic, Shyam Rangila, is physically prevented from filing his nomination, is that very different from a state where an opponent of the government is picked up in, at the airport and sent to jail? Most Indians would say, yes, it's very different. We are democratic, Russia is not. I would say it's not very different. In it, the Portland resistance, the idea that people in the United States either wear dinosaur costumes, go to where ICE. By the way, Apple, Tim Cook's Apple, has taken off the App Store an app that tells iPhone users where ICE agents are in any city. This is primary information. It has nothing to do with anything that is illegal. It just tells you where these people are. Apple was too scared of the Trump administration to be able to leave that app be and took it down. And this is in a country that it sees itself, forget how, Prem and I would see it, that sees itself as being the epitome of free speech, the First Amendment, as they keep talking about. But even there, it's hard. Having said that, I think that there is always space in India or the US, even in Russia, as we've seen, for people to be able to express themselves, hopefully safely. But humor, I would say, is the most effective antidote to tyranny.
Yeah. Okay. So I think thank you all for coming to the screening and for staying on for the discussion. And thank you, Akash. Thank you, BIC, as always, for enabling our screenings here. Good evening and good night.